Lao Tzu once wrote, "Everything that lives has a physical body, but the value of a life is measured in a soul." The morning seemed normal enough until I walked into the kitchen. My scream could not have helped the situation before me. A blackbird was flapping around my kitchen. It was quite a dramatic scene as I sought to calm myself and reason as to how to get this seemingly vile creature out of my house. In those moments, I measured very little value in the life that flapped before me. Clearly, out of my fear, I was not a fan of birds, at least not in my home, and not at that moment. It was anything but peaceful. Aren't birds supposed to be peaceful? When I gaze out of the picture window from my living room, they seem peaceful. My backyard is full of wildlife, with cardinals and blue jays nesting among the admittedly overgrown plant life. And there I witnessed the value of these little souls. Birds are beautiful creatures, and I do appreciate them. But I've never been able to relate to them quite in the ways that the biblical character of Noah seemed to do. In the biblical narrative, we are introduced to birds of many types. The psalmist speaks of how God will carry us as if we are on eagle's wings. In the book of Genesis, we meet both a raven and a dove. The raven stands in contrast to the dove, but my job today is to focus on the dove itself, as portrayed in the narrative well known as Noah's Ark. The story suggests that God had become so angry and essentially at God's own wit's end in dealing with the corruption of the people that God vowed to wipe clean the earth. The whole of the story is not unlike the myths of many cultures. The ancient Greeks had their version, and perhaps the most well-known is the Epic of Gilgamesh that came out of Mesopotamia. In it, there is a story of a god who is distressed by the behavior of people, and he sends out a flood that is to wipe out all but one chosen one. And that one is commissioned to build a boat. And much like Noah, that one sends out a raven and a swallow to determine, after the flood, if the waters have receded. Listen now to a section of Noah's narrative as it refers to the birds in his care. After 40 days, Noah opened the window he had made in the ark and sent out a raven. And it kept flying back and forth until the water had dried up from the earth. Then he sent out a dove to see if the water had receded from the surface of the ground. But the dove could find no place to set its feet. So it returned to Noah in the ark. And he reached out his hand and took the dove and brought it back to himself in the ark. He waited 7 more days and again sent out the dove from the ark. And when the dove returned to him in the evening, there in its beak was a freshly plucked olive leaf. Then Noah knew that the water had receded from the earth. He waited 7 more days and sent the dove out again, but this time it did not return to him. The resemblance to the myth of Gilgamesh is absolutely undeniable. But one of my favorite theologians, Dr. Walter Brueggemann, has said that if we are to understand this narrative, we must put the lens of the mythic perspective aside and view this narrative through the lens of the Hebrew people. He suggests that the narrative is an invitation to understand the relationship of the people of Israel to their God. That relationship is rooted in a covenant promise, a promise that brings the responsibility of Israel's faithfulness to God and God's responsibility of faithfulness to Israel. Listen once more to the specific verses about the dove and get the picture fully in your mind. Then he sent out a dove to see if the water had receded from the surface of the ground. But the dove could find no place to set its feet because there was water all over the earth. What do we actually know about doves? We know that they hail from the same family as pigeons. Together with pigeons, doves constitute 310 different species. Doves are small birds, and they appear to walk very gingerly. They fly really fast. Mourning doves, in particular, are known to fly at about 55 miles per hour. They eat seeds and grass. And as parents, both male and female care for their offspring. We also know that during the First World War, likely because of their flight abilities, soldiers would send out pigeons with messages attached to the birds. And these birds became known as carrier pigeons. They gained the perspective of messenger birds. We see that characteristic at work in this narrative as well. We are told, when the dove returned to him in the evening, there in its beak was a freshly plucked olive leaf. The olive leaf communicates a message to Noah. The water has receded, but perhaps not quite enough. Olive trees, as we know, do not grow terribly tall, but they are tall enough for the leaf to be indicative that dry ground could not have been that far off. As a culture, we have come to see the dove as a symbol of peace. We use the image of a white dove with the olive leaf in its beak rather regularly, it seems. In truth, we do not know if this dove was white, nor what species of dove it may have actually been. And it doesn't really matter. It is a story, after all. It was Pablo Picasso, though, that we have to thank for that image. It was Picasso who made the dove the emblem of peace when his rendering was adopted as the symbol for the 1949 World Peace Conference. Perhaps the story does indeed stand as an emblem for peace, but it also stands as an emblem of forgiveness, of reconciliation, and of God's grace. Listen to this part of the beautiful narrative. He reached out his hand and took the dove and brought it back to himself in the ark. I could never have imagined reaching out my hand in my kitchen and bringing that bird back to myself. Can you imagine Noah doing just that? What love that exemplifies for the bird. What an expression of gratitude is communicated in that action. What an acknowledgement of relationship. Noah could measure the value of that little dove's soul. I would submit to you that nowhere else in this passage do we see a more clear picture of the sacred nature of covenant than in the exchange between Noah and the dove. It is an invitation to see a clear analogy. God is to Noah what Noah is to the dove. Hear that one more time. God is to Noah what Noah is to the dove. The gentle dove happily proceeds to its assigned task and returns to its master. This is the relationship that God expects of Noah and of the Hebrew people. The bird is purposeful, but initially unsuccessful. In its return, it communicates that lack of success to Noah. We know that not everything in life goes perfectly. But when we return to our source, our caretaker, as the bird did, we find protection, nurture, and love. The bird returns to its mission, and in that act, we see resilience, motivation, obedience, and trust. The bird carries a message in the olive branch leaf. That communication symbolizes relationship between the bird and its master. It is willing to engage the task to which it is called. And it is wise enough to render clear evidence that the master can understand. Their language was not the same, but their connection and the communication between them speaks volumes. It is as if there is an understanding between Noah and the dove. The dove does not return, and the message is clear. It is done. Renewal of the earth can now begin. Israel is to be a covenant people, a people with a mission, subservient to their God, who is their source for protection, nurture, love, companionship, and nourishment. God needs their communication. Ultimately, the message of the dove appears to be that peace does come amid most, if not all, situations, if we choose to be in a true covenant relationship with God. It doesn't take long before the Hebrew people forget that. Perhaps our society should be asking itself if it is willing to embrace that truth too. Perhaps we should be asking ourselves Lao Tzu's words. Everything that lives has a physical body. But do we value the lives measured in the souls around us? May that be our challenge, to live in a way that values other souls. Thank you.